Welcome back, friends. Today, we're making unusual watermelon recipes from countryside life. In our case, watermelon was never just cut and eaten. It was a whole little ritual, usually happening outside, with someone shouting, "Don't throw the seeds here," every 5 seconds. No matter how many perfect recipes you see online, nothing beats the messy, real-life countryside way of doing it. If you're into this kind of cozy food stories and honest kitchen chaos, subscribe for more. Meanwhile, we're here scrubbing this old barrel like it holds family secrets. And honestly, it kinda does. We rinse it out properly, fill it with clean water, and get it ready for the real deal. Fermenting watermelons the old countryside way. It always feels a bit dramatic, like you're preparing something way more serious than just food. Right now, me and my husband are loading up this cart with hay. Sounds random, I know, but this is actually important. We're lining it with hay, so the watermelons don't just get thrown in and bruised. It works like a soft, natural cushion, keeping them safe while they slowly ferment in the barrel. In the countryside, nothing was ever just thrown away. Even hay had a job in the kitchen story. So now, let's actually talk about watermelons, because this simple summer fruit has a way longer story than people expect. The earliest traces of watermelon go back to Africa, where wild versions were actually not sweet at all, more like survival food with a lot of water inside. Imagine biting into that and thinking, yeah, this is fine, I guess. Over time, watermelons spread through trade routes into the Mediterranean and further into Europe and Asia. And what's interesting is, people didn't just eat them fresh. They started experimenting. Salt, fermentation, storage in barrels, basically anything that could stretch summer into winter. Here in Ukraine, watermelons became this kind of emotional summer symbol. Not fancy, not expensive, just very real. You don't serve watermelon here, you share it. Whole families outside, cutting it on a table that's slightly too small, juice everywhere, nobody caring. Salted or fermented watermelons are especially common in late summer and early autumn. People store them in wooden barrels with brine, sometimes adding herbs or garlic, depending on the household. Every family has their own secret version, of course, even if the base is basically the same. There's something kind of funny about it. The same fruit that we now associate with beach days and Instagram pics was once a serious winter storage strategy. Just survival and practicality. And still somehow, it became comfort food. I always think it's funny how differently we treat it now. Today, you just grab one from a supermarket and hope it's good. Before, choosing a watermelon was almost a social skill. Like first, the sound test. You tap it and listen, but nobody ever really agrees on what good sound means. One person says it should be deep. Another says it should be hollow, but not too hollow. And suddenly, you're standing in the middle of a market, having a full debate about a fruit. Then, there's the weight. Heavier usually meant juicier, like it was holding summer inside it. And the field spot, too, that pale patch on the side. People used to say, if it's too white, it's not sweet enough. If it's golden, it had time to really grow properly in the sun. Where I grew up, watermelon was a summer ritual. You'd bring it home like a prize, tap it like you actually knew what you were doing, and hope it didn't betray you with that pale, sad inside. If it was good, the whole house changed mood instantly. Suddenly, everyone was not hungry, but somehow standing in the kitchen. And I think I love watermelons so much because they feel like summer without trying. No effort, no rules, just cut it open, and suddenly everything slows down a bit. It's messy in the best way. Juice on your hands, seeds everywhere, no one pretending to be elegant, just people actually enjoying food without overthinking it. So right now, my husband is basically turning into a kitchen scientist, cutting off the watermelon ends and blending the inside into this super soft, almost frothy mix. It's funny because it looks chaotic, but this is exactly how simple watermelon juice turns into something like a smoothie without any effort. Watermelon drinks like this actually have a long cultural life. In a lot of places, it wasn't even called smoothie. It was just fresh juice or crushed fruit. In Mexico, for example, there's agua fresca de sandia, where people just blend watermelon with water, and sometimes a bit of lime. And in Ukrainian and broader Eastern European traditions, there was always this same idea of fruit drinks. Long before anyone said smoothie, people were making compote and uzvar for centuries, boiling or soaking dried and fresh fruit, cooling it down, drinking it ice cold in summer kitchens that already felt like an oven. The funny part is how universal this idea is. You don't need a blender to understand it. People were smashing fruit long before kitchen appliances existed. Mortar and pestle versions of fruit drinks existed in different cultures, just because summer heat pushes everyone toward the same solution: make fruit drinkable. In modern times, smoothies as a concept became popular much later, especially with the invention of electric blenders in the 20th century. That's when fruit drinks started becoming a lifestyle thing in cafes and homes, instead of just something practical you did in the heat. And now, we're moving to the next thing. My husband is literally about to cut open this watermelon, like it's a pot. We will take out the flesh, and the plan is a bit wild. We're putting a whole chicken inside and baking it right in the watermelon. It sounds like a joke, but it's one of those kitchen experiments that makes you pause for a second like, okay, let's see where this goes. And what's actually interesting is that the idea of stuffing food into other food isn't new at all. In Ukrainian cuisine, and honestly many others, there's a long tradition of stuffed dishes, like holubtsi, where cabbage wraps rice and meat, or baked pumpkins filled with grains and meat in old countryside cooking. The logic is always the same. One vessel, everything inside, slow cooking, full flavor. In Ukrainian cooking, we've always had this slow, enclosed baking logic, though. Think about traditional ovens, pek, where food was just left to gently cook for hours. Chickens, potatoes, apples, everything went in and came out soft, slightly caramelized, very homey. Technically, what's happening here is pretty simple. The watermelon works like a natural sealed container. Inside, the chicken cooks in steam and its own juices, while the watermelon slowly breaks down and adds moisture. It's less about watermelon-flavored chicken and more about soft, juicy, enclosed cooking. And if you're into these slightly chaotic kitchen experiments and real food stories like this, you might as well stick around and subscribe, because things are definitely not getting more normal from here. And now, my watermelon smoothie is literally cooking on the fire right here. I'm just giving it a gentle stir, like you would with something that actually makes sense on a stove. So now I'm cutting the watermelon rind into pieces. And honestly, this is the part most people just throw away without thinking. But here, it's going straight into preservation, which feels very old kitchen logic. Nothing gets wasted. Everything gets a second life somehow. In Ukrainian home cooking, watermelon rind actually wasn't useless at all. People used it for jam, yes, watermelon rind jam, and sometimes even lightly pickled versions. It sounds unexpected, but in countryside kitchens, the rule was simple. If it's edible, it can be turned into something sweet or stored for later. And this idea isn't only Ukrainian. In different parts of the world, especially in southern U.S. cooking, pickled watermelon rind became a thing too. Same logic, sweet part eaten fresh, hard white part turned into something tangy and preserved, so nothing from the fruit disappears. There's something kind of funny about it, because the rind tastes like nothing at first, just crunch and water. But once it's cooked with sugar or brine, it completely changes personality. It's like the most underrated part of the fruit finally getting its moment. In my case, this part feels very hands-on and slightly chaotic because you're holding what used to be trash and turning it into something intentional. And the texture is actually perfect for soaking up sugar or brine. So it genuinely works. And now, the chicken inside the watermelon is finally going into the oven, which still feels like the kind of sentence you wouldn't believe outside of this kitchen. It's heavy, a bit wobbly, and honestly, I'm just hoping it behaves itself while it bakes. The final thing for today, we will put whole watermelons into a barrel for fermentation. And this is honestly one of those old countryside methods that looks a bit wild at first, but in Ukraine, it's been known for generations as a way to preserve summer without fridges. Just salt, water, time, and patience doing all the work. In Ukrainian rural traditions, fermented or salted watermelons were especially common in late summer when harvests were overflowing. People didn't want anything to go to waste, so instead of just eating everything fresh, they stored it in barrels for winter. Vegetables, apples, cabbage, and yes, even watermelons. The logic was very simple. If it grows in August, you better make it survive until January. So barrels became like small time capsules of summer. And every family had slightly different recipes, even if the base idea was just salt, water, and natural fermentation. What's funny is that people today rediscover this, like it's something trendy and experimental. But for older generations, it was just storage. No aesthetic food blogging energy, just, we need this to last through winter, or we're going to be sad in February. In fact, records from European court kitchens show that preservation methods like pickling and brining were widely used because fresh produce wasn't available year-round, even for royalty. There's also an interesting contrast. While aristocratic tables in places like France under Louis XIV were famous for elaborate fresh dishes at Versailles, even their preservation systems existed behind the scenes. Because no matter how rich the table, seasons still controlled agriculture. Back in Ukrainian villages, though, there was no separation between kitchen craft and life craft. People were literally building winter security. A barrel of fermented vegetables or fruit meant stability when fields were empty and snow covered everything. Watermelon joining this system is actually very logical when you think about it. It's mostly water, it absorbs salt well, and it survives in brine without collapsing immediately. So it became part of late summer barrel traditions in some rural regions, especially when harvest was abundant. In parallel, similar preservation thinking existed globally. For example, in the United States during the 19th century, pickled watermelon rind became common in home kitchens, especially documented in Southern cookbooks, because households tried to use every edible part of the fruit. Even famous historical figures are indirectly connected to this culture of preservation. For example, George Washington's Mount Vernon estate kept detailed records of food preservation, including pickling and storing produce for winter use, showing how universal this need was across social classes. And right now, I'm squeezing fresh lemon juice over these boiled watermelon rinds and pouring everything into jars. It looks a bit unusual, like something between jam and experiment, but this is exactly that old kitchen logic again. Sour plus sweet plus a time, and suddenly, something completely new appears in the jar. So I'm finally cutting the watermelon for us. And honestly, this feels like the most normal moment after a whole day of chaos in the kitchen. We're about to have dinner with watermelon and the chicken that literally baked inside it. And I'm curious, have you ever tried anything even remotely similar? Like cooking something inside a fruit? Or doing one of those, this shouldn't work, but somehow it does, recipes? Because I feel like every culture has at least one wild kitchen experiment hidden somewhere. Fun little fact about us. This whole cooking thing is basically how our kitchen usually works. No strict plan, no perfect timing, just let's try it energy. And somehow it ends up being dinner. And what I love most about days like this is how food turns into a story instead of just a meal. Like today, we fermented, boiled, baked, blended, and somehow still ended up with dinner on the table. Thank you for watching this whole kitchen chaos with us. Seriously, it means a lot. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and stick around. There's definitely more coming. Today, we're baking something that smells like every Ukrainian childhood at once. Homemade apple pie and stuffed apples straight from the farm. Here, apples are memories baked into dough, warm hands passing plates, and that first bite that tastes like home. And if this feels like home to you, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the simple village recipes that carry whole stories inside them. So we're grabbing the baskets and heading into the orchard. And every time I do this, I remember that apple growing in Ukraine goes back centuries. Monasteries in Kiev and Rus kept orchards because apples stored well through long winters. And winter here is not a joke. And then there's Yabluchny Spas, Apple Savior, on August 19th, part of the Feast of the Transfiguration in the Orthodox tradition. People would bring apples to church to be blessed. And before that day, children were not supposed to eat the new harvest. As a kid, I remember staring at the tree like it was personal betrayal. My grandma would say, "Wait for the blessing." Meanwhile, my cousin was chewing quietly behind the shed. Ukraine has always been one of Europe's major apple-growing countries. The climate is perfect, especially central and western regions. Apples weren't luxury fruit here. They were survival fruit. You dried them, you made uzvar, you stored them in cellars wrapped in paper so they lasted into February. I still remember opening the cellar door and that cold, sweet smell hitting your face. Even in royal Europe, apples mattered. In England, orchards were carefully cultivated under monarchs like Henry VIII, and apple varieties were recorded like family trees. And I always think about how different countries built identity around apples. French tarte tatin, Austrian strudel, Polish sarlotka, but Ukrainian kitchens had their own quiet pride. Simple apple pies baked in wood ovens, slightly overfilled, always generous. During the 19th century, estate gardens across Ukrainian lands, especially in regions that were part of the Russian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire, cultivated dozens of apple varieties. Pomology was a real science. There were catalogs of apple types. Imagine being that passionate about fruit. Meanwhile, today we just say, red one or green one. Apple picking was also deeply communal. Families, neighbors, everyone helping before the cold came. It wasn't romantic Pinterest autumn. It was real work. Ladders wobbling, hands sticky, someone always shouting, "Careful!" And yet, somehow, those were the happiest days. In Ukrainian folklore, apples symbolized youth and love. There are wedding rituals where apples were part of matchmaking traditions, symbols of fertility and prosperity. During Soviet times, collective farms massively expanded apple production. Ukraine became one of the largest producers in the region. Apples were everywhere, in school cafeterias, in factory lunches, in jars of compote lined up on balconies. My mom says autumn smelled like boiled apples and sugar. Honestly, it still does. While I was talking, I already washed all the apples. Typical me. I can't just stand still. Now I'm slicing them, and later we'll lay them out in the sun to dry a little. Sun-drying apples is such an old habit here. In villages across Ukraine, sliced apples were spread on linen cloths, rooftops, even clean attic boards. My grandma used to guard them from chickens, like it was a national mission. Ancient Romans dried apples and stored them for winter journeys. Pliny the Elder actually wrote about different apple varieties in the 1st century. Imagine documenting apples that seriously. And honestly, I respect that level of obsession. Somewhere in Rome, someone was arguing about texture, just like we do. Even royal courts relied on dried fruit. In Tudor England, under Henry VIII, dried apples and pears were common in royal kitchens, especially in winter months when fresh fruit wasn't available. There are records of large quantities being stored for the household. In Ukrainian homes, dried apples weren't a snack for fun. They were practical gold. You'd thread them on strings sometimes, hang them near the stove, let warm air finish the job. By December, they'd go straight into uzvar, that Christmas drink with dried apples, pears, sometimes prunes, honey. Every sip tastes like stored sunshine. As kids, we'd steal the driest, sweetest slices and pretend we were helping. We were not helping. Honestly, laying apples in the sun today feels rebellious in a small way. We could rush, but letting them wilt naturally gives them that deeper sweetness, slightly caramel taste when they dry. Old methods survived because they worked, also because people had no other option. But still, I'm heading out to feed apples to my horse. She's already waiting, like she knows the whole kitchen operation is secretly for her benefit anyway. Growing up, I remember how animals were always included in harvest time. Nothing was wasted, everything shared. All right, now we're moving into the serious part, stuffed apples. And it always feels funny calling it serious, because on paper, it's literally apples with filling. But in reality, this dish sits on this huge old line of history where people were trying to make simple fruit, last through winter, and still feel like something special. Across Europe, baked and filled apples show up in old cooking traditions again and again because apples were one of the few fruits that survived storage, cellars, and cold seasons without turning into tragedy. So people worked with what they had: honey, nuts, dried fruit, and somehow turned survival into comfort. In older European cooking traditions, especially in medieval and early culinary manuscripts, fruit wasn't treated like dessert the way we think now. It was just food that you made better if you had time and ingredients. Apples were often baked, stewed, or combined with honey and spices because sugar was rare and expensive. Even in noble kitchens, fruit dishes were about transformation, taking something basic and making it feel richer without losing its simplicity. In Ukrainian homes, stuffed and baked apples, pecheni, yabluka, became this quiet winter classic. Nothing dramatic, just apples from storage, filled with whatever the household had: walnuts, raisins, honey, sometimes poppy seeds. And I swear, every family had their own version of what counts as enough filling, which always turned into a light argument in the kitchen. And what I love is that this dish wasn't tied to one class or one place. In villages, it was everyday food in colder months. In wealthier households, it could appear more refined, sometimes with more elaborate spice mixes. But the base idea stayed identical everywhere. Baked apples, stuffed with something sweet or nutty, because heat changes everything. The apple goes soft, the filling melts into it, and suddenly it feels like a completely different dish without changing its identity. Across Europe, especially in medieval and early modern periods, fruit-filled dishes appeared in both humble and royal settings. In England, historical cookbooks, like The Form of Cury, include fruit preparations with spices and sweeteners. Apples were never rare in royal kitchens, but how they were prepared mattered more than the ingredient itself. France and Central Europe also developed their own apple traditions, baked apples, pastries, strudels, but the logic stayed the same. Soften the fruit, add richness, make it warm and comforting. Everyone looked at an apple and decided it deserved a softer, sweeter life. From a food logic perspective, stuffed apples make perfect sense. Heat breaks down the fruit, sugar concentrates, nuts toast, honey melts. Everything inside starts blending into one soft structure. It's basically controlled transformation. Nothing fancy, just chemistry doing its thing while people pretend they're doing something ancient and meaningful in the kitchen. And if you're still here, you're probably the kind of person who understands why simple food like this hits deeper than it should. Stay around, subscribe, because I'm cooking stories that somehow survived generations. So right now, I'm just scooping out the apple centers, and honestly, it's not the most glamorous part of cooking, but I always get this weird satisfaction thinking about what it becomes later. This simple step, removing the core, is actually something that shows up in old European cooking for centuries. Because once apples started being used in baked dishes, people needed ways to make space for fillings without destroying the shape. A small practical tip I always use: don't rush the coring. If you go too deep, the apple collapses in the oven and loses that nice structure for stuffing. Keep the walls a bit thick, like the apple is still protecting itself a little. That way, it holds the filling but still softens beautifully when baked. In historical kitchens, especially in European estates and palaces, fruit preparation was surprisingly structured. Kitchen staff would use small corers, knives, sometimes even specially shaped tools, to hollow out apples carefully so they could be stuffed with spices, nuts, or sweet mixtures. It was almost like quiet precision work, because presentation mattered a lot in noble dining culture. So now I'm finally filling the apples. And this is honestly the best part, because suddenly everything you did before makes sense. Stuffed apples have had so many versions over time, from simple village fillings to really elaborate ones in European kitchens. The most classic sweet version is honey, walnuts, raisins, sometimes a bit of cinnamon, because those were the ingredients people actually had through winter and stored well. But stuffed apples weren't only sweet. In some European traditions, especially more modern variations, you'll also find savory versions filled with grains like buckwheat, cheese, herbs, sometimes even minced meat. It sounds unusual now, but historically, fruit and savory combinations were more common than we think, especially in older European cooking, where sweet and salty didn't have strict boundaries. And now, we're moving to the best part, apple pie. And in Ukraine, this whole story actually sits between home tradition and European influence, especially from Western regions like Galicia, where Austro-Hungarian cooking left a big mark. That's where you start seeing more structured pastries, strudels, and layered apple desserts slowly blending into local home baking. But the idea is simple everywhere. Apples plus dough plus heat. Comfort you don't argue with. If we go way back, in medieval Europe, pies weren't even what we imagine today. They could be savory first. Meat, vegetables, stored fillings baked inside dough that worked more like a container than something you actually ate at first. Sweet pies came later more gradually when sugar and fruit preservation became more common in household cooking. In England, apple pies became especially popular because apples grew well and stored through winter. Early cookbooks show simple combinations of apples with spices and dough, nothing too fancy. Over time, it turned into a national comfort food idea, something warm, simple, and deeply tied to home kitchens, rather than luxury dining. In Ukrainian tradition, apple pies often came from the same logic as everything else: harvest, survival. Apples were stored in cellars, dried, or baked into dough when there was too much fruit to handle at once. So pie wasn't dessert culture. It was basically a smart way to not waste anything from the orchard season. In European royal kitchens, pies in general were more about abundance and skill than specific ingredients. Elaborate crusts, decorated tops, layered fillings. It was a way to show that a household had both resources and time. Apples often appeared in these desserts because they were reliable and easy to transform with spices and sugar. And honestly, the most real version of apple pie is still the family kitchen one. I always think about how every house has that moment. Apples being sliced, dough everywhere. Someone saying just a small piece. And then suddenly, half the tray is gone before it even cools. Spices like cinnamon and cloves came through trade routes and slowly became part of apple desserts across Europe. That's why apple pie smells the way it does today. It's basically history of trade, migration, and home cooking all mixed into one oven moment. So the apples go into the oven first. And honestly, there's something almost ceremonial about it. Like they're taking the first step into warmth after everything we've done with them today. And then the pie goes in right after, like it's following them into the same story. Now I'm slicing a few more apples so my husband can go feed our cows. And honestly, this is one of those parts of farm life that feels very Ukrainian in the most normal, unromantic way possible. Like you're baking a pie in one corner, and in the other corner, someone is literally negotiating with animals over snacks. Cows here aren't just livestock. They've always been part of family rhythm, especially in villages where milk, butter, and cheese were daily survival, not luxury. And yes, cows absolutely love apples. They're naturally attracted to sweet, juicy fruits, and apples are easy for them to digest in small amounts. In rural life, people often used apples as a seasonal treat for cows, especially after harvest when there was abundance. There's also this funny thing. Cows have really strong memory for routines in places where they've been fed something good before. So once they associate apples with happy moment, they will absolutely remember it, which means my husband walking out there with apples is basically becoming a very predictable event in their daily calendar. Okay, finally, the pie and the apples are ready. I'm pulling them out of the oven, and honestly, the whole kitchen just changes in 1 second. That smell is ridiculous in the best way. Baked apples, warm dough, a little caramel from the honey we added inside. This is the moment where everything earlier suddenly feels worth it. Look at this. The pie crust has that golden edge that looks way too perfect for something that came out of my kitchen. Now the best part, I'm going to drizzle a bit of honey on top. And in Ukrainian cooking, honey is almost like a finishing touch that connects everything together. So now I'm curious, do you prefer baked apples like this or actual apple pie? And what's your must-add ingredient that makes it feel complete for you?
Уже зразу осінню запахло.
And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, really. If you enjoyed this little kitchen story, subscribe and stay around, because there's more coming from this cozy chaos. See you in the next one.
М'яско так гарно пропеклося.